in terms of working to improve attendance. This has been a, in terms of MTSS PBS, this has been a multi-year process, and they're still looking at it as a 3 to 5 year process going forward. And they've particularly worked on attendance since the beginning of this school year in September. This is a national problem, because what we've seen is we have folks from 25 states in the District of Columbia with us today. So at the Maine Institute, we support over 50 districts and 177 schools doing MTS, PBS. It's all kinds of, from looking at discipline to looking at attendance to looking at equity, that we focus on, and within a multi-tiered model. And just to, this is kind of a pre-correction here that as I said, the Gardner's been working on this from September, and in early part of March. They looked at the data, and all the schools in Gardner have shown an increase in attendance from January to February, which is a pretty cool event. And this is the district email that went out from Amber and from Superintendent Pellegrino. Just talks about in terms of kind of the direction and some of the things that they thought were really important practices that made a difference in terms of their attending. So if we look at how we define attendance, one is regular attendees miss less than 5% of instructional opportunities at risk, 5 to 9%. Chronically absent, which is 10%, which is about 18 days in a school year, with severely chronically absent missing 20% or more of instructional opportunities. So, and this could be excused absences, unexcused absences. This could be from suspensions. We count basically a missing a school day as part of attendance. So we have kind of some before the COVID pandemic, right? If we look at in terms of that this is from the U.S. Department of Education. This is from 2015 to 16. It's the latest data up on the U.S. Department of Education site. That over 7 million students missed 15 or more days of school in 2015, 2016. That's 16% of the school population, or about 1 in 6 students. And absenteeism in the first month of the school can predict poor attendance throughout the school year. So really, we really want to look at this from the beginning of the school year. Over 8 million students miss nearly a month of school each year, and 1 in 10 kindergarten and first grade students are chronically absent, which really affects in terms of their academic performance. And this information came from Attendance Works, which is a free site that focuses on attendance. It's a great site. I'll put the site up at the end. And that missing 10 days of school, or about 18 days, right? Most school days negatively affects students' academics performance. And that this is a huge problem with equity. This is kind of one of the leading indicators around equity, because students who live in communities with high level of poverty are 4 times more likely to be chronically absent. For reasons beyond their control, such as unstable housing, unreliable transportation, lack of access to healthcare. As I said, this is a huge issue relative to equity, that we see underrepresented, and special populations have greater issues with attendance, particularly students with special needs, racial minorities, from poverty, from single parent households. So we really need to look at in terms of how we support these students, both with their families as well as themselves. And with a lot of students, the family really makes a difference in terms of their attendance. And poor attendance can influence whether children read proficiently by the end of 3rd grade or being held back. And by 6th grade, this is kind of the leading indicator whether a student will drop out of school. So we really, it's important that we attend to attendance. And this just really got exacerbated during the COVID pandemic. So that's the statistics before the COVID pandemic. And then you can see in terms of the media, attendance plummets at the California School District. 46% of students have missed more than 10 classes in spring semester. So really across the board, attendance plummeted. And then also engagement, whether the students came on or off, or other types of measures of engagement also plummeted as well. And in Los Angeles, there were 40,000 students failed to check in daily with COVID. And the other thing, it's tricky to measure attendance during COVID. And the Gardner schools have really done a really nice job in terms of operationally defined attendance in terms of the COVID pandemic. And then, as we said, this is a huge equity issue that oftentimes poor students, right, low-income students suffer the worst in terms of attendance issues. So it's really more than just a school issue, it's really a community issue as well. And as we work with schools, we have 3 guiding principles that we use, whether we're working on equity or whether we're working on attendance or problem behavior or discipline or academic performance. But these are kind of the 3 guiding principles. 1, we look to support schools to improve outcomes and intervention. And we want to look at selecting evidence-based interventions that allow all students, I underline all students, to experience more instructional minutes by improving attendance, reducing negative, reactive, punitive, exclusionary discipline practices, improving engagement and on-task behavior. And really importantly, particularly when we're dealing with attendance, it's really improving student, parent, and community partner relationships. If we have a student in a homeless shelter, the reality would be we really need to work with that homeless shelter to help support in terms of what's going on. And just as an example, we had one school district that we worked with that in terms of relationships, if they had a student in school that had an attendance problem and they really didn't have a good relationship with the family or no relationship with the family, they would call the older sibling school and say, is there any special person that has a relationship with this family, and try to use that way to get into the family in terms of working around influencing attendance. And so there's some evidence-based practices. We're not going to go through them at this point. We don't have enough time, but relationship home visits that work on building that relationships. Mentoring is a good way in terms of building that relationships as well. The other thing was we really worked to help schools select a database decision-making multi-tiered system to improve wellness and academic performance, as well as social emotional competencies. And our second guiding principle is selecting interventions and processes that are staff time efficient. Nobody has any extra time. And on the other hand, support staff wellness, because if the staff is not well, then the students can't be supported well. So that's our second. And our third guiding principle, we want to look at interventions and processes that are resource efficient and produce the largest outcomes. And Rob Horner, who used to direct the National Technical Assistance Center, is now senior advisor, taught us to do the simplest things that will result in the biggest outcomes. So those are our 3 guiding principles that we use. And there's 2 really major worries. One is educational staff haven't often been trained in evidence-based school and classroom attendance support strategies. And if they have been trained, oftentimes they don't receive coaching, and Gardner's just done a super job all the way around in terms of coaching their staff in terms of how to look at improving attendance, and then really providing data and performance feedback to say, this is where it's working and this is where it's not working. And one of the goals is really to look at in terms of how we can decrease time devoted to responding to behaviors attendance, and basically decrease the use of tier 2 and tier 3 practices. So if we have effective tier 1 school-wide and classroom practices, we are going to have less time devoted to responding to behaviors or issues, and less time using dedicated tier 2 and tier 3 practices. So if we look at remote learning opportunities, kind of what are the three main reasons for low attendance engagement in these remote learning opportunities? And in Massachusetts, that's where we're coming from. You probably can tell because of my accent. I park the car in Harvard Yard on a regular basis. Schools are coming back in session on April 5th. There are a number of states that basically have never gone virtual or hybrid, but everyone's in a different place. But our feeling is in some cases, there's still going to be remote learning situations, and our goal would be improving attendance and engagement in those situations. So we look at it, there's three main reasons: the students who cannot engage, students who will not engage, and students who do not engage. Right, and now the student who cannot engage, and this is where we look at equity, particularly poverty, and other access issues that, either no internet, a lack of an available device, illness or family member illness, or other family obligations, that this is really the kind of the most area that we look at equity impacting on. And then we have students who will not engage, right? There are aversive situations, they're embarrassed in terms of their home and in terms of what's going on. They may be engaged in online bullying or some type of discomfort. They may have their brothers and sisters walking by in terms of what's going on, or instruction or activities that are too difficult to do in absence of in-person support. Right, which may be special needs students who really need a lot of support in those areas. Right, or finally, we have students who do not engage because the remote learning activities are not sufficient engaging or reinforcing, or competing activities are more reinforcing. So and the online instruction may provide fewer opportunities for students to respond. There's less relationship building in those opportunities. They may come to school because I'd love to be with my friends and I really can't be with my friends online. So all of those things may attribute to that. So when we're looking at attendance interventions, we want to try to figure out in terms of interventions is why the particular student is not coming to school. So these are the typical interventions where, we got this from one school and then I've shared it with a number. Oh yeah, these are the interventions that we primarily use. And they tend to be reactive. They tend to be when students are at the chronic level, which is, remember, 10% or 18 days. And they're not really reviewed by a team in terms of database decision-making. Oftentimes there's not a flow chart that says this is what we're going to do. People aren't trained in terms of parental communication. So in some schools we worked with, it's kind of a punitive note that goes home in terms of why the hell is your student not here? Obviously that wouldn't be the language, but rather than, boy, we really miss you, we want you to come back to school. How can we help problem solve in terms of what's going on? So it's and as I said before, if the school resource officer is doing a home visit who may have no relationship with the family, is how can we have somebody that has some type of relationship with the family do that home visit? So what we look at in terms of with attendance is looking at in terms of this needs to involve educators working collaboratively with students, families, and the community. This is not just a school problem. This is, a family and community issue. And that we really look at approaching it from a systemic, preventative, supportive, and proactive way to support students and their families. And from a systemic basis, our goal is really to reduce the need for more resource and time-intensive interventions so that schools can really attend to those students who have the most challenges. So our step to solution, which Gardner's going to walk through, is basically how do you define the problem? And then probably the biggest thing that Gardner will suggest that they've done is really providing easily accessible disaggregated data at the school level. So that teams can look at it, staff can look at it, and so that people can make good decisions. So that was been one of the challenges is how do they take their current data system and really make that data available to schools so they can make good intervention decisions. And then the next step is how to resource map and tier current interventions. So, oftentimes the interventions are more tier 3 interventions, and the goal would be is how do we look at tier 2 and tier 1 interventions to reduce the number of students that need tier 3 interventions. All right, and then in some cases, and if you look at Gardner's perspective, that they had a whole bunch of interventions, which Amber will review. Really what they did was look at in terms of more tier 1 and tier 2 interventions, not necessarily changing other than kind of organizing their tier 3 interventions. And finally is kind of how do we progress monitor? How do we look at progress monitoring at a whole school level or at a classroom level or at an individual level? How can we look at in terms of what we're doing? Is that making it different in whatever unit of analysis we're using in terms of changing attendance? So as I said, this is a huge equity issue, and Superintendent Pellegrino will talk about that in terms of Gardner's really focus on that. We feel this is, makes huge difference in terms of the kind of the underrepresented and specialized populations, and that we really approach this from what's the systems that support in terms of staff engaging in evidence-based practices, that they have data that they can use to make good database decisions so they can basically implement effective and efficient practices. So this is kind of a rubric that we look at, whether it's equity or whether it's problem behavior or whatever, but we think this is huge relative to equity. All right, so oftentimes we see schools will have a siloed attendance team, and that one of the things we suggest is that you don't silo your attendance team, you put it really into your MTSS, PBS initiatives. We feel that administrative support in both Joyce and Mark have really done a super job in terms of providing leadership and administrative support in terms of both their MTS PBS initiative, that there's representative database decision-making teams meeting regularly, and Gardner in terms of their teams, their tier 1 team meets once a month, tier 2 once a month. Tier 3 is just bringing it off the ground, and that they have access to representative disaggregated data to make really good decisions, and that the faculty, in some cases, we're looking at families sharing representative data, and that that team-based development of problem statements are based on data. So if we can develop good problem statements, where it's much more efficient in terms of how do we move forward. I'm not going to talk a lot about this because Amber is going to really talk about this, but one of the things we gave Gardner is how can they disaggregate their data by school-wide, class period, by individual, by day, by subgroups. Most schools can do it school-wide, but when you begin to drop down in terms of the other disaggregated data, it's hard for schools to actually have that information to make good database decision. And importantly, we suggest that schools develop problem statements for intervention planning, and I'll show you an example, and that the schools prioritize the least time and resource intensive interventions, right, that we want, since nobody has extra time or resources, and that that they use their data to really progress monitor and problem solve. So here's a precision problem statement from one of the Gardner schools. So almost 45% of the students have 5 or more absences, with grade 3 having the lowest attendance percentage rate on Wednesday. So how would we look at in terms of using this for intervention planning? Well, we can look at, this is really a school-wide problem because we have 45% of the students are at risk. So how do we address the school-wide rather than individual student by student? Grade 3 has the lowest attendance rate. So can we go in and look at Grade 3, they're really teaching the students about the importance of attendance, reinforcing students for attending, maybe with a variety of acknowledgement and reinforcement programs. And one of the actual things that the school did on to address Wednesdays is they made fun Wednesdays, fun Fridays, but they had fun Fridays and fun Wednesdays, and they showed a nice increase in terms of their attendance during Wednesdays. So the other thing in terms of those tier 1 practices, kind of incorporating attendance into school-wide and class-wide expectations, kind of be there, and the educational staff teaching kids in terms of what it means to be there. Acknowledgement systems for attendance, dojo points, individual recognition, other systems, class competitions, class grade school recognition systems. Also educating families on the importance of attendance and relative to educational achievement and dropouts. And one simple intervention is just sharing the data with families, because oftentimes families don't feel they feel their kids are in school a lot. And, you know, this is just a simple icon here that shows what the attendance, and particularly when it's episodic attendance, then, you know, he really hasn't been out all that much. To the extent you can share the data and kind of what this looks like relative to chronic attendance. This is a student with chronic attendance problems, then sometimes just sharing the data makes a difference in terms of family paying more attention to attendance. All right, this is a school, a high school. This is back before the pandemic, that they had an attendance pride wall. And you can see the 11th grade had the best attendance. They actually got one of the Gardner middle schools actually used this as well as a way to make people aware of it and to provide some acknowledgement systems for the 11th grade teachers for having the best attendance rate in the school. And then if we look at in terms of those students at risk, so basically at risk, we would say 5 or more. Days missing, which you could see, which if you remember, Gardner had like 45% of the students in one school that were at risk during COVID. That we want to look at catching them early in the year before it becomes a chronic problem. That the more we can catch it early, then the better chances we have to change the trajectory in terms of attendance. We'd want to look at standardized protocol. So kind of what would be the standardized protocol for connecting with the family? Are there, you know, are we reaching out in terms of, we missed you, come on back? How are we looking at in terms of those standardized? Or as I showed you in the beginning, there was a whole bunch of interventions, but they weren't necessarily standardized in terms of who would do what when. And part of the goals would be developing kind of a flow chart in terms of kind of when we would do the interventions for particular students that are at risk, or modified checkout, or small group interventions as well. Right? And then we're at tier 3, and most schools can really identify their tier 3, those students with chronic attendance issues, both excused and unexcused. How do we identify those students? How do we do more individualized assessments, examining functions and circumstances, antecedents? How do we look at individualized protocols versus standardized protocols for these particular students that would focus on supporting their students and families? So I'm going to transition over to the Gardner Public Schools so they can really talk about the awesome work they've done. But just to give you a relationship we've had with the Gardner Public Schools, we've provided a senior doctoral BCBA for over 10 years, focusing primarily on district professional development and behavior intervention support for particularly around those students with high risk students who needed tier 3 interventions. Over the past year and a half, we've kind of helped them focus on the development and implementation of their MTSS PBS systems, data, and practices. Since last September, under the leadership of Superintendent Pellegrino and Joyce West, who's the Director of Pupil Personnel Services, the district has intensively focused on improving attendance, and we've actively supported them in terms of doing that. And This is really a 3 to 5 year process. We're kind of in the beginning stages in terms of that, although we've got some very good preliminary data that they'll share. So I'm going to turn it over to Superintendent Pellegrino.
All right, thanks, Bob. So Amber, if we could just go to the next slide, that'd be great. Thank you. So Gardner Public Schools, we're a small urban district in Massachusetts. If you can see there from the map of Massachusetts, we're right smack dab in the center of the state, in the northern part of the state. We have 5 schools. Each one of the schools has one grade per school. So grade 1 is only in at our Waterford Street School, for example. So all the way through grade 12, except for our alternative school, we do have a small alternative school to work with students who have significant needs. If we go to the next slide, please. So Gardner's demographics, I want to mention that we've really changed demographics, and that's been an interesting piece of the adaptive change that we need to go through with many of our faculty. Now, if you look at these numbers, I want to mention that back in the early 2000s, our economically disadvantaged percentage was under 15%. We had 0 English language learners, and we had less than 10% of our students were students of color. So as you can see from these numbers, they're drastically different than they were back in the early 2000s. So the change we really had to focus on is with faculty. Could we move to the next slide, please? So our theory of action in what we were going to do. So since I became superintendent in February of 2017, we've done a lot of work around equity work for discipline, specifically of students from marginalized populations, specifically special education, students of color, and our low-income students from low-income families. We did a great job, quite frankly, of not only reducing greatly all suspensions and discipline throughout the district, that includes office referrals, we've also greatly reduced any disciplinary disparities. We still have a little bit of ways to go, and we still have work to do, but we've done a phenomenal job with that. But when the district leadership team was talking about what our next step was, we realized that it's not about an initiative. It's not about a specific focus. So we did not seek to create an attendance committee or an attendance team. Instead, we wanted to create a committee that would focus on equity issues in the district, inequitable outcomes, and reduce those inequitable outcomes, whether it's academic or social, emotional, mental health. So we have 2 legs for our MTSS, multi-tiered system of supports. We have 2 legs. One is the academic leg, and the other focuses on social emotional learning, mental health issues, and behaviors. So that's what we're going to primarily focus on today, because that group doesn't necessarily act in isolation, but that's the group that we've focused on over the past year. So as our theory of action for this is, in order to have a robust multi-tiered system of supports, we need to have leaders at every level that focused on equity, had a primary goal of developing this system, and have the capacity to develop leadership and actually do the facilitation themselves as well of these meetings. So if we go on to the next slide, please. So really we're focused on 2 things. The first thing is leadership capacity, and the second thing is actually helping them develop the MTSS system, because we've never had a system like this before that's truly sustainable and helps the principals actually manage their own workload. By pushing many of the issues to the team, it's a better decision-making process, it's a more thoughtful process, and they can keep their eye on many different indicators, specifically of inequities in our district. So one of the first things that we did was we did hire a coordinator coach, which is Amber, who you'll be hearing from later on. And we needed someone. I couldn't just tack this on to our PPS director, our special ed director, because this is too big of an initiative to just have as a tack on to their role. We needed someone who's keeping their eye on the ball, creating the manuals, doing all the legwork to make sure that this is a district-wide system. Secondly, we also partnered with Lynch Leadership Academy, which is the doctoral program at Boston College. I participated in a fellowship with them. They're a phenomenal program, and their focus is on equity. So they've been working with our administrators over the past couple of years to help them identify equity issues, to move along the cultural proficiency continuum, to learn to do data-driven decisions and facilitate meetings. So we've been doing that for the past couple of years, working with Lynch Leadership Academy. We also are using Lynch Leadership Academy to train district level staff on how to coach principals and facilitators. So they're actually getting coaching on being coaches, which we think is really important as we move forward. We can't just tell the administrators on how to do things and then walk away. We have to make sure that we're coaching them, supporting them, and that we're doing a gradual release where ultimately Amber and Joyce won't have to attend any of these meetings because our folks will be where they need to be in terms of skill set, and the system will be robust and sustainable. We also partnered obviously with the May Institute, which we've had a long-term partnership with them, as well as our own state's MTSS Academy. And they've helped us. We've taken a lot of advice from them. We've used a lot of their critiques on the actual implementation. They helped us do our self-assessment and the like. I do also want to mention, though, since the very beginning, we've been focusing on building our own team. So Lencioni's books on 5 dysfunctions of a team, meeting ourselves to death. We focused a lot on meeting facilitation and team development. So we as an administrative team were tight and we could work together to accomplish a lot of our goals. We've also done things like difficult and courageous conversations. So now, though, our professional development for our administrators is focused on developing the MTSS model. If you would mind moving to the next slide, please, Amber. So we want to utilize the MTSS to address any type of issue that we have in the schools. So instead of continually coming up with another initiative or another issue, we want MTSS to gather the data and address it using the team to make sure that when we create a solution, it's a long-term solution. It's not a Band-Aid. It's not for this year, and then next year we focus on something else. Leaving that, I look at these things as spinning plates, where we might spin a plate really well. When we move on to the second plate, we have to keep this one going. Then when you go on to the third plate, you got to keep the first 2 going. We need a team of people looking at this data and responding to it on an ongoing basis. So we're looking at data more in terms of checkups as opposed to what am I thinking of when it's already done, when we can't do anything about it. So our annual testing is a summative assessment, which we're not going to be able to address anymore. All we can do is move forward the best we can with the next set of kids. We want to respond in the moment to help kids immediately. So there's a lot of different meetings we have, and you'll see here we have several meetings. I actually attend several of the core SEL MTSS meetings at the schools. I also attend some of the facilitators meetings when I can. They're posted actually, so anyone on the administrative team can attend. Every principal has an evaluation goal that we created that specifically says they're going to create an MTSS system. Each one has a slightly nuanced goal, as their needs in each school might be a little bit different. We also strategize on a weekly basis, all the executives at the district level, on what we need to do next with MTSS. And I also meet with Amber and Joyce on a weekly basis to talk about, well, these are the strategies that we want to do. Now, what are we going to do about it? How are we going to move the principal or the school or the process? How can we make this happen? And I also want to say we meet twice monthly about the SEL MTSS program. Both of the PPS director and I meet with our principals to talk about MTSS and any issues that they're having. And again, we use that time as professional development time to help the principals move forward. So this is a lot of meeting time, but it's the way that we can communicate to continue the process moving forward. Most of this is about relationships and helping people see their goals and developing the skills to get to those goals. So with that said, I'm going to turn things over to Amber, who I'm sure you're much more excited to be hearing from. Thank you.
Thank you, Mark. I'm going to be focusing on how our MTSS framework folded in attendance. Pre-pandemic, our attendance data for 2019-20 was below state average. This year, with the pandemic, like many schools, we experienced a further decline. Some of our specific challenges and barriers included defining attendance in virtual remote settings. Different schools were defining and recording it differently, and our data source, Rediker, was very cumbersome to pull attendance reports, and it was difficult to export those into a way that we could view them for visual analysis and in graphic form. We were not using a district-wide system. We were a district of schools versus a school district. Each of our schools were doing their own thing in regards to monitoring attendance. There was no consistent cycle of data review of how often. There were no consistent data points for disaggregation or guiding questions. And like I said, the data was very difficult to visually analyze. Our attendance interventions prior to MTSS were primarily Tier 2 and Tier 3 focused, and were mostly response and reaction based. Our school teams definitely got an A for effort, throwing everything they had, including the kitchen sink, at it. However, efforts were not coordinated nor efficient. These challenges led us to incorporating attendance into MTSS. This has been our first full year implementing this district-wide system, so we're still building the plane as we're flying it, and people that know me know that I say that a lot. We've been pre-correcting and with lots of modeling, lots of coaching for school teams, we found to be really crucial to success. We adapted a behavioral skills training model. So we provided descriptions, both verbal and written, through our MTSS manual and our facilitator's guide of the target skills we wanted teams to implement. We demonstrated the target skills through modeling facilitation during district and facilitator meetings. Then we had our MTSS facilitators practice those skills in their own meetings, since this was a district-wide initiative, followed by feedback either during a one-to-one debrief meeting and or written feedback notes following their MTSS meetings. Implementation conditions for success, as Mark previously mentioned, included our district leadership involvement. Without our superintendent's commitment, our pupil personnel director's commitment and direction, none of this would have been possible. Other really key systems of success included the coaching, technical assistance from May Institute, disaggregation of attendance data for database decision-making, our MTSS SEL manual and supporting tools to help guide teams, as well as the MTSS facilitator support, both in MTSS content and leadership, technical, adaptive, and facilitative. And we also focused a lot on results, process, and relationships. Our district-wide system for MTSS and PBIS implementation focuses heavily on the 4-step database decision-making process: define, identify and analyze, develop and implement, as well as evaluate. This timeline follows our early adopter, one of our elementary schools. Back in October, November, we really focused heavily on step 1, defining. We defined attendance, what it looked like, versus being here versus being engaged. We created a more efficient data source, and we identified data points and guiding questions. Moving into December and January, we moved into step 2, analyze, where we created problem statements and identified decision-making criteria for entrance into Tier 1 versus Tier 2 and Tier 3. Through the months of February and March, now we've been developing and implementing. So we've turned our problem statements into outcome goals, and we've prioritized those outcome goals and interventions. And we've been beginning to identify progress monitoring tools and fidelity measures, all along continuously evaluating our systems, practices, and data, and our student outcomes. The data representation was a challenge. The May Institute recommended disaggregating the data in this way. And back in September, we were only able to view our average attendance by month. We decided we rose to the challenge, and we developed a data template using Excel with how-to guides and trained all of our district secretaries to run a core 8 reports that could then easily be turned into the attendance spreadsheet and then autographed. One of our assistant principals from our early adopter school, who was sort of our Excel guru, was instrumental in making this happen. Now we're able to disaggregate by all the subgroups and more. And some of our next steps include beginning to look at individual student trend graphs, beginning to look at individual students by tier with an automatic student flagging system, and beginning to triangulate our data across other data sources, including our ODRs with Swiss and Ed Handbook, as well as our universal screeners such as BESS and some of our failure data. Here are a few examples of our 8 core reports graphed using our new data disaggregation system. We are now able to do it by month, like I said, by day of the week, homeroom teacher, race, ethnicity, and individual student. And as you can see in the day of the week, the line graph, the peaks really represented Wednesdays, which was our remote day. At our administrative council meetings, we celebrate successes. And we found that this has been a really key in changing behavior as well. We now have sort of an unofficial competition with Excel spreadsheets for best data review across schools. So our middle school has begun adding on top of our original attendance data spreadsheet and is beginning to work on individual student trends by number of absences per month with the goal of a decreasing trend, as well as ways to flag students by tier with automatic color coding, yellow or red, when a student meets criteria based on a certain number of absences identified. This is a work in progress and has not been yet replicated across all of our schools. Once we had our data disaggregated, we developed a script for guiding questions and then trained teams how to use them following the behavioral skills training model. We provided the instructions, the script, to reference our guiding questions that corresponded to identified data points. And then we reviewed that tool in district level meetings. We modeled the guiding questions to review attendance data in our facilitators meetings. And as it was a district initiative, all facilitators followed. And then we provided feedback to our MTSS facilitators. We identified 8 primary guiding questions. Everyone probably has attendance by month, as we did back in September, but we wanted to drill down further by grade, by IEP status, race, ethnicity, by EL, English language learner groups, day of the week, classroom, course, and staff. It was key that our guiding questions matched our disaggregated data points. We found that the 8 primary guiding questions were not enough. Follow-up questions needed to be scripted as well for details and context. For example, it wasn't enough just to ask, what's the average attendance rate by grade? We really needed to add additional prompts to our teams. What grades have the lowest attendance? What does that mean? Are the grades increasing, decreasing, or no change? Is this the same as previous months, or does it vary? From answering our guiding questions and follow-up questions, we developed problem statements. Following the same behavioral skills training process, we trained teams in creating problem statements. And as Bob mentioned earlier, our example problem statement from our early adopter, having 45% of our students with 5 or more absences, with grade 3 being the lowest attendance rate on Wednesdays during virtual and remote learning. Once we had our problem statement, we began our road to resource mapping. We provided the triangle example from the May Institute to get teams thinking about interventions by tier. Some used that, and others took that idea and put it into a spreadsheet color coding their interventions by tier. But ultimately, all teams were to take their resource mapped lists and put it into an intervention matrix that outlined core components for interventions, identifying whether the interventions are evidence-based, what do the interventions target, what's the area of student need, what is the fidelity tool that would be used, and how would we progress monitor. Our early adopter, elementary school, had an increasing trend from October when we started this process. While we adjusted our emphasis to universal prevention, tier 1 interventions for all students, it was not one best intervention that really caused this change. We found that it was more the emphasis on attendance data shared at the whole school level and focus on class-wide expectations and incentives. At the district level, we have had 355,870 instructional minutes gained from our January to February attendance rate increase across all schools, making every minute count. Some of our next steps include using our data to measure fidelity, assess effectiveness, and improve efficiency. so we no longer need to throw the kitchen sink at it. As Bob quoted earlier from Rob Horner, let's do the simplest thing that will result in the biggest outcome. We've developed a fidelity checklist to help guide our teams through this process, with scripting out our fidelity guiding questions as well. Our interventions now are more prevention-based, emphasizing universal Tier 1 for all students, both at the school-wide level and class-wide level. Some of our school-wide things we've done is we've had some schools have grade level dojo point competitions. Our early adopter school, these pictures come from that school. We've had grade level attendance competitions at our middle school. And at the class-wide level, we've had school, store, and fun activities on our remote days and created a virtual menu. Expectations and acknowledgement points for being here and being engaged, and improving engagement and on-task behavior using the classroom observation tool with feedback. Returning to full in-person on April 5th, we're anticipating increased anxiety and school refusal. We're planning to continue our emphasis on prevention and Tier 1 universal interventions while making plans for a red carpet return with music, previewing our expectations ahead of time, and possibly animal petting, because we all know that animals increase serotonin levels. Thank you.
Amber, can you go to the next slide? So that was a great presentation. Gardner's really done a terrific work, and they're only just starting down the pathway, but they've got some really promising outcomes. Some other resources, the PBS Technical Assistance Center has some great resources. There's too many to list. If you go in and just go on pbs.org and put in attendance, so come. Another free website that is really good is Attendance Works. That both of these sites really have great free resources around attendance. Next. So the big ideas was, as you can see from Gardner, they have an awesome superintendent. He's competing for Superintendent of the Year award, as well as Joyce in terms of her Director of People Personnel Services. She sees her job as supporting all students and just not those students with special needs or other problems. Probably the biggest thing was having an easy and accessible disaggregated data that the schools can use. And that there's been a big focus to move away from kind of just addressing students with chronic attendance issues to more school-wide, class-wide, and Tier 2 interventions. And they've done a really nice job in terms of resource mapping their interventions and working on developing a flow chart in terms of how those interventions would be addressed. And beginning to do more progress monitoring, and really have worked on coming up with acknowledgement systems. I just got from the middle school, they have a contest now in terms of staff implementing PBS, and they are able to provide acknowledgements and prizes to teachers who've done really a nice job in terms of that. And the biggest thing I think they've done is had fun. They really have looked at in terms of this is a learning process, and they've tried to make this as fun for staff and for students and for parents in any direction they can. Next. So we have several minutes for about 9 minutes for questions, and actually Amber and I will stick around afterwards if we don't answer all the questions within the next 9 minutes. I know Toby or Christine, you were going to prioritize the questions.
Yes, so I'll start with a shorter one. We have David asking, what did you use as incentives for staff, maybe for Amber?
Some of the incentives we did, we had kind of a budget per school. And so we used more like gift cards, and then they would be entered into a raffle. So teachers would get points, and then those points would be put into a raffle, and then a name would be drawn for a gift card. That's been one of our most like teacher incentive.
And the middle school did a preference assessment. They came up with a bunch of different of both activities and other things that they could look at in terms of providing incentives. Like some of the incentives were kind of a get out of early school card, or somebody cover their duties, or somebody cover their class for a little bit in terms of that. So that a variety of things, activities along those lines. So they did the reinforcement assessment to figure out what the staff really wanted.
Awesome. And this one might be a little directed towards Mark if he is still there, but people wondering sort of, oops, sorry, it just disappeared, why you prioritize SEL in your role and sort of how you manage that as part of your job. And just the fact that you're able to sit on teams at the school level is amazing to Amy, who asked the question.
Thanks. Fortunately, again, my district's a little bit smaller where I only have 5 schools. In terms of managing it, I feel like this is the most important part of our work. When I think of the research that's out there right now on who has the biggest impact on a child's education, we know it's the teacher. But the second most important person is the principal. And so that the burden to make sure that the principals are leading the schools in the direction that I expect is on me. And fortunately, I have a great team. Frankly, Joyce West and we have a chief academic officer as well. And I have been together for a few years now, and we've really been working as a team to help principals and the leadership move forward, because we know if we can move the leadership forward, the schools can move forward. I have, some principals who they're gung-ho, they do their job extremely well. And it's actually been interesting to institute this new change for them. There's been some struggles around that, quite frankly. So I just believe I don't know how I manage it necessarily, but what I can say is it's my primary activity is to move principals. And so I put that as the first thing on my calendar each week. We've been, so the assistant superintendent and I have been meeting bi-weekly with our principals for the past, since I became superintendent. And so I meet 1 week with them, she meets the next week with them, and we kind of divide it, the 5 and half, and we just kind of go back and forth. Now Joyce has joined me because with the SEL goal being so important and again, having a few difficulties and bumps in the road in terms of moving people forward, it was important that the message from Joyce and about the MTSS and the importance of it, I wanted the weight of the superintendency in those meetings. So that's been really helpful, I think. And Joyce has been a phenomenal coach. And I have to say, I don't know if she wants to talk about it all, but she has really shined as a coach, especially now that she's getting some coaching from an outside organization. Boston College is helping us with that. And I can really tell the coaching skills and the questions she's asking have really moved some principals forward and the work forward a great deal. I don't know if I actually answered that question, but I just put it as my main priority, I think, is the bottom line.
Great. And then another question, probably for all of you guys, did you find resistance from anyone? And if so, how did you respond?
Go ahead, Mark, you want to take that?
No, I think Joyce, I don't know if you want to chime in first.
Yes,
here.
Joyce. Yes.
Sure. Mark and Amber are such a blessing, because I think everything that they've said around, some unintended consequences, we certainly expected some resistance. And so it was really important for us to have conversations about, scripting some of the change, building habits with our teams. How would we go about that? And because we were all so passionate doing that, some of the unintended consequences are, why are you people so involved? Why are you here? We got this. And so I think for us as a team, we had to work through that and process through that with teams around how change actually happens in such a large organization. You know, now you're taking a school and we're trying to make the change district wide. So through that, I think it was a lot of honest conversations with people who were resistant, and to really explain the why of why we're present, why it's important right now in the middle of a real substantial change, why that's important. So I hope that answered the question. I'm not sure.
I do want to follow up a little bit too. So I've been lucky enough to, I've been in this district since 2011. I was a principal of the alternative school, then appointed the principal of the high school. Joyce was actually, the director. She became the director of special education. And I'll never forget, I had a very, very tough case at the high school where for the first time ever, I had a student in a substantially separate program that was stripping and peeing on the floors. And I was really frustrated. I've never seen that before. And I said, this student can't be here. How do we do this? Like, I don't know how to do this. Nobody knows how to do this. And they had designed a plan, and Joyce had a conversation with me and said, stick with the plan and see if it works. If the plan doesn't work, we need to adapt the plan. And she pushed me. I bought into it, hook, line, and sinker. And when the plan eventually worked and the students' behaviors turned around 100%, and then I was able to actually educate this student in my school. I was proud of my school. I was proud of my staff. I thought it was just phenomenal work. And it changed, who I was as a leader, I think. So now being the superintendent, just because you have what I realize is just because you have a good principal and a principal who can change things, creating a system and how you do things and why you do things is very important. So just because I can address a particular issue, that issue is going to come back if I don't have a team of people on looking at the data, responding to the data on an ongoing basis. And I think that's the thing that I've really learned, from working, being lucky enough to work with Joyce. And there was resistance from some of our principals who are really great principals. They're phenomenal. And I wouldn't trade them for the world. But they had to learn that it's not just about putting a Band-Aid on it. It's not just about, hey, I addressed this problem, and then seeing that problem pop up again in 2 years when you refocus your attention on something else. So that's the work that Joyce is really, Joyce and Amber have been really doing with creating this system. And there's definitely been resistance that we've had to work on.
Yeah, we had to redefine our relationships and our working relationships. And I think for any change to happen, you're going to go through that. And the other thing is you have to withstand the unpleasantness and to keep working on it, because it's easy for people to want to throw in the towel because they're all frustrated. And what we do know about this is that Amber had mentioned we didn't have everything figured out, and you're not going to have everything figured out, and that you have to be able to be comfortable with that to some extent. And I think that for us has been a real, takeaway with this whole process.
I think one of the things that I learned from Joyce, there was one of our principals was questioning the process. And after talking with Joyce and working through it, the next time he came into an issue, he solved the problem. And then when he and I were debriefing the solution, he said to me, well, I know what Joyce is going to say. This isn't a system yet. So I've still got to keep working on this to make sure it's part of the system. And that's when I knew that we had him, and which was great.
So we're going to have to finish up. Thank you for all attending and your great questions. And we'll end the webinar now.